أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم
Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah. All praise is due to Allah, and may His peace and blessings be on the last messenger of Allah. Assalamu Alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome back for the last part of our 4-part series, How to Be Unapologetically Muslim and Live Your Best Life. So if this is your first one, I'm so happy to have you. And if you've been attending the previous ones, welcome back. It's wonderful to have you as well. So over the last 3 weeks, we've come a long way. And so what I want to do before I get into the topic for today is to sort of look back at what we've covered so far. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. If you missed those sessions, I do encourage you to go back and rewatch them. But just to give you sort of an idea of where we've been, especially if this is your first session that you're joining today. So I want to start by just defining, what do we mean by unapologetically Muslim? So unapologetically Muslim is when we are confident of our faith inside and out. So when we're confident on the outside, what that means is that we are able to communicate effectively about Islam with others. And when we're confident on the inside, we become immune to criticism. In other words, no matter what the negativity is on the outside, it doesn't affect us internally. So our iman is stable no matter what. And so that's the position, that's the state that we want to all be in, right? We want to feel confident of our faith inside and out. And this is something that can sometimes be very elusive, especially in our time when Islamophobia is rampant, and it has, been given so much fuel over the last couple of years by our former president. He created a very toxic environment for Muslims. And so in this environment, for Muslims to be able to stay strong with their Muslim identity is something that we all aspire to. So the first part is that it's about being confident inside and out, and being immune to the negativity on the inside. And then the second part, living your best life. So what do we mean by that? Does that mean having a pain-free life? Does that mean getting anything you want? Not exactly. So living your best life, we mean showing up as your best self in every area of your life. So I believe that in order for us to be unapologetically Muslim, we have to address our own needs first. We have to look at what I teach in my program is the 6 key areas of our life. And this is everything from our personal life to our professional life to our spiritual life. So we need to take a holistic approach, especially, again, given all the challenges that we're facing. If we simply try to address everything by just saying, well, I just need more knowledge of Islam, and if I have that, then I can be strong and I can be confident. And of course, knowledge goes a long way. It's important. We need that as a building block, but alone it's not enough. We need also the mindset and the skills for how do we apply what we know, and how do we show up confidently in the world. So not just that we have the knowledge to practice privately in our own lives, but how do we show up as Muslims in our public lives when we're going to school or work or volunteering? Because we've all been in those situations where we've been asked questions about our faith, and sometimes even with the simple questions, we freeze because we don't know what to say. We haven't prepared ourselves. We haven't really thought about it. Sometimes, you might get defensive, or you might feel awkward not knowing how to answer a question. And so what we talked about last time was exactly that, which was the whole piece about how do we show up confidently as a Muslim? How do we communicate effectively? And this is the 4th C in my 5 C's of personal growth, which I teach. I feel like it's so important for us as Muslims today to not just have the knowledge, but also be able to communicate it effectively. So last week, we talked specifically about how to communicate with others about Islam. And I talked about 10 mistakes that most Muslims make when talking about Islam. And I'm going to recap a little bit of that today because it also applies to our topic for today, which is specifically how to communicate effectively with other Muslims about Islam. Now, before I get to what are some of the common mistakes and how can we overcome them, I want to sort of set the stage and talk about why is this an important topic. You might think, well, I definitely want some help, talking to other people about Islam, but I don't need any coaching in how to talk to other Muslims. And the fact of the matter is that we often get into disputes with other Muslims unknowingly or not wanting to, because we don't always understand where other people are coming from and why their practice may be a little bit different or why they may be having certain questions and so on. So I want us to spend a little bit of time just sort of on the mindset part of this. Like, what is our attitude when we go into these discussions with other Muslims? And so when we talk about conversations with other Muslims about Islam, there's a couple of different scenarios that we can encounter. So one is a Muslim who is just as practicing as us, but who may have a difference of opinion on a specific issue. So that's one scenario. Another scenario could be a conversation with a Muslim who is at a very different point in his or her journey with Islam. So outwardly, they may not appear as practicing as we are. So how do we, deal with those situations? And then finally, there's also that situation where you have a Muslim who's struggling with their faith. And they could be, even in that, there's two different categories. You could have someone who is struggling, but who genuinely wants to understand, who wants to overcome their doubts, who wants to get their questions answered. And then you also have some who are who've already kind of checked out basically from the faith. And when they're talking to you about Islam, they're not doing it with the intention of wanting to learn or get their doubts clear. They're actually doing it from a place of argumentation, where they've already checked out and they may even want to try to convince you to leave, along with them. So there's lots of different scenarios that we can encounter when we talk to other Muslims. And so having the right mindset when we go into these conversations is important. The reason it's important is because when we look at the research around why Muslims in America today are having doubts about Islam, one of the big reasons that they give is their interactions with other Muslims. So we might assume that it's the teachings of Islam, they're having a question or a doubt about that, and that is sometimes the case. But it's also often the case that when a Muslim has a negative experience with another Muslim, especially with the Muslim that they would identify as being a religious person, in that case, the behavior of that person towards them can play a big role in how they feel about the religion itself. And this is something we're kind of familiar with when it comes to non-Muslims. So we know that, people who are not Muslim will often judge Islam based on the actions of a small group of Muslims, and usually that's Muslims, extremist Muslims, Muslims who are, halfway across the world, but they use that to sort of form an opinion about all Muslims, including, those of us who are in this country, who are law-abiding, citizens, who are peaceful people, but they have these notions and they kind of project them onto the whole entire Muslim population. But when it comes to Muslims, what often happens is they're not necessarily using the behavior of Muslims who are extremists or whatever, but they're looking at the behavior of Muslims in their own community who they feel are, quote unquote, and I don't really like this word, but religious. I prefer the word practicing because it kind of puts us all on a level playing field. But if someone considers another Muslim to be, quote unquote, religious, and then that person behaves in a negative way towards them, they sort of take that as rejection by the faith itself, or an indication that well, Allah must not be happy with them because they're not a good Muslim. And so, knowing that, we want to obviously be kind of mindful of how we approach these conversations, because the last thing that any of us wants is to be the reason that another Muslim is getting distant from Islam, right? I mean, we as people who are unapologetically Muslim, we want to show up confidently. We want to be, confident of our faith, and we want to be friendly with people that we interact with, not just with non-Muslims, but also with our fellow Muslims too. We want to be the reason why another Muslim gets encouraged and motivated to strengthen their iman and get closer to their faith and closer to their community, not a reason that they feel more distant from it. So having all this in mind, so we talked about, the Muslim who is struggling, and as I mentioned before, there's also those who are not struggling. They're practicing just like you, but, well, they're not just like you. They're practicing, but they might have some different views on certain things. So how do you approach those conversations? And the thing to remember in that case is that you might be very, very certain about your particular point of view on a subject based on the evidences from the Quran and Sunnah that you've looked at or that your teachers have taught you. But what you need to remember in that case, when you're talking to a Muslim who is sincere, who genuinely, cares about their faith and wants to practice it to the best of their ability, is that they could be looking at some of the same evidences and coming to different conclusions, right? They might have been taught in a different way, where they interpret certain things, one way that might be different than you. And rather than become, argumentative in those cases, we want to be open to having a dialogue. And then the last one was, Muslims who are at a different level in their journey. So this is someone who, appears to be not as practicing as you are. And so how do we sometimes, unfortunately, behave towards Muslims who are at different levels of practice than us? We often walk into those situations with a certain number of assumptions about, how much effort they're putting in or how much they really care about Islam. And what we need to remember is that none of us knows how far another person had to go to get to where they're at. So what do I mean by that? Now, let's say you and I, were someone that was born into a Muslim family. So we didn't have to go out and search for Islam. It just it landed in our lap. We didn't have to do any work for it. Many of us grew up in loving homes, homes where Islam was presented in a loving way. But now think about someone who grew up in a dysfunctional home, someone who grew up in an abusive home, someone who grew up in poverty where everything was about survival. There was no time to, really give good tarbiyah and teach you about your faith or whatever. It was just all about survival, always about just getting through the day. Think about someone who maybe converted to Islam later in life. So they did not grow up in a Muslim family. So they had to do all of their learning on their own. So when you see them, maybe making certain mistakes or not practicing the way you do, we always have to remember that maybe we had certain advantages that other people did not have. Maybe knowledge just came a lot easier to us. Maybe we grew up, in a home where Islam was taught lovingly, or, we were able to attend Islamic school or Sunday school. Not everyone has that opportunity. So we need to sort of keep an allowance in our mind for these things. Now, as I say all of this, I want to be really clear about one thing. What I'm talking about, having empathy and, open dialogue with other Muslims who are either practicing differently or who may be at a different level in their journey with Islam, I'm not talking about normalizing sin. I want to be really clear about that. Obviously, we have our values, we have our beliefs, what we believe in, what we try to practice to the best of our ability. But what I'm talking about is that it is possible to validate the struggle without validating the sin. So you can validate that someone is going through a rough time, or that someone hasn't gotten to that point yet where they've learned X, Y, and Z. Or you can validate the fact that someone may be having some doubts, and they deserve to get answers to those. So those are things that we can have empathy for, and have a dialogue with people for. But that doesn't mean that we are simply normalizing sin, that we are validating sin, that we are saying that, oh, because it's hard, it's okay, completely okay, whatever, you're doing. That's not my point. So I want to be really clear about that there is a way where we can, be strong in our faith. We can be firm in our conviction. We can practice inwardly and outwardly. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that we have to be patronizing towards those who are at a different level, or that we have to be critical of the person. It's okay to make, to give people feedback on actions, but we don't want to make the person themselves feel like they are being criticized. So it's really a fine line that we have to try to balance when we're having conversations with other Muslims. Now, what I want to do now is talk about some specific strategies. So that was more of a mindset, more of a, what kind of attitude do we want to come with? And how can we have some empathy by reminding ourselves of, why people might be at different points in their journey, how they've been treated by other Muslims, their upbringing, the challenges they had to face to gain the Islamic knowledge that they have. All of these things can play a factor. What I want to talk about now is, what are some of the mistakes that we sometimes make in our conversations. And some of this is going to be a repeat from last time, because a lot of this is an overlap with how we communicate effectively with others. But then there's also going to be some stuff that is going to apply, particularly here. So the 10 mistakes that I often see Muslims making when we communicate about Islam with others. The first one is allowing the other person to shame us for our views. So if you're talking to someone, for perfect example of this is someone who is basically checked out of the faith. And so when they talk to you about Islam, they're basically looking down on you and trying to make you feel inferior for being a practicing Muslim. And so one of the mistakes that we make is allowing the other person to make us feel small when they have this view. The opposite of that is the second one, which is going on offense by becoming harsh. So an example, this might be when it comes to communicating with other Muslims. Someone poses a question to you, or they question, one of your views or the way you practice something in Islam. And rather than just have an open discussion with the person, you immediately become defensive and you kind of go on offense, actually. And you when you feel like you're being attacked, you end up attacking the other person. And so that's the second one. And then I'm going to go through all of these, like how can we address each of these? The third one is launching directly into the answer. So this is where, someone walks up to you, they ask you a question, and you immediately, fire back with what you think the answer is to that. And I'm going to tell you in a moment why that's not the best strategy to use. Number 4 is doing a brain dump. So this is when someone asks you a question and you tell them everything you've ever learned about that topic. So this is information overload, and it's something I see a lot. Number 5 is looking unhappy, uncomfortable, looking like you're kind of stressed out while you're having this conversation, like you don't really want to be there. The next one is trying to prove the other person wrong, thinking that that's your job in this conversation is to prove them wrong. Number 8, needing the other person to agree with you. So feeling like you can't be satisfied with this conversation unless it ends with the other person basically admitting, that your way is right. The next one is conceding defeat or otherwise ending abruptly. So this happens when we get stuck in a conversation and we don't know the answer to something. sometimes the way we deal with that is we just prematurely say, okay, well, yeah, maybe you're right and I'm wrong. Or we just sort of abruptly leave the conversation without any kind of um, closing or resolution. And then the last one is not knowing when to walk away. So this is kind of similar to number 4, doing a brain dump, but that one was specifically on one specific question. This one is just where you do answer the question, but then you just keep going on, and not knowing when to close out the conversation. So these are some things that are some common mistakes that we make as Muslims when we are talking to other people about Islam, whether they are people outside of our faith or even fellow Muslims. So what can we do about that? How can we address these things? So the first one is that we always want to remember that we want to be confident in these conversations. We want to be confident and also nice. Not nice in a people-pleasing sort of a way where we are begging the other person for their approval, but nice in a sense of we're treating the other person in a pleasant manner. We're friendly, right? We want to be polite and have impeccable manners. We don't want to let the other person walk all over us, but we also don't want to act like we're better than them. So we don't want to have either an inferiority complex or a sense of superiority. Instead, we want to act as equals. So if it's another Muslim, then, okay, you're a Muslim, I'm a Muslim, let's have this conversation. Or if it's not a Muslim, then you're an American and I'm an American, let's talk as equals. I'm not saying that you would say those exact words, but that's how you want to bring yourself into this conversation. So that kind of addresses the first 2 mistakes. The next one was launching directly to the answer. So instead of doing that, what we want to do is we want to start with some sort of an opening, like, thank you for your question, or, yeah, I'd love to answer that for you. Thanks so much for asking me that. What this does is it sort of sets up a friendly tone for the conversation. Even though it's something so simple, it's just one phrase, but it kind of signals to the other person that you are confident and ready and happy to have this conversation with them. Really simple. It sets you up on a positive note before you even get into the actual conversation. The other thing it does for you is it buys you a little bit of time to think about your response before you charge right into it. So those are the 2 reasons why it's good to have some sort of a short opening before you get into the conversation. The next big mistake was doing a brain dump. And this is something that we do either out of nervousness, or we want so much for that person to agree with us, or to see us as being knowledgeable. We don't want them to not have confidence in what we're saying. So we think that by going on and telling them everything we know, that we're going to make a better impression. But what happens is the other person gets kind of turned off by that. It can be very overwhelming to just hear this really, really long answer. And the other downside of that is that when we're going on, we don't really know where the other person is at with this issue. So it's not helpful. You may be giving them all this evidence and all these great points, but if their question is really a little bit different than what you're addressing, you're not helping in any way. So what's a better approach than just giving a whole lot of information at one time is to break it up. So keep your answers super short, super simple, and then let the other person ask a follow-up question if they want to know more. Or, if they don't say anything, then you can ask a question, kind of to gauge where they're at. What I just said, did that make sense to you? What do you think about that? Sort of try to figure out where they're at before you give more information. So keeping your answers short and simple is really, really helpful when you're having a conversation about Islam. The other one was looking unhappy and uncomfortable. So it's important that your overall body language is one that is open and friendly and confident. So you want to have an open stance. You don't want to have your body all hunched up or turning, away from the person. You want to be focused squarely on them so they feel like your attention is on them. And this also gives shows your confidence when you're squarely facing someone as you're talking to them. Also things like good posture, so kind of sitting up and not being slumped, and good eye contact as well. So you don't want to be looking around or looking down at your phone or appearing distracted in any way. You want to be showing the other person that you are fully present for this conversation. And then also your facial expression. So you want to appear relaxed and you want to be smiling. It doesn't mean you have to have a smile plastered on your face the whole time. It doesn't have to be fake. Be yourself. But, from time to time, just kind of ask yourself, oh, am I just kind of looking serious the whole time? And you want to break that up a little bit and just, remind the person through your facial expression that you're happy to be there and that you're enjoying yourself having this conversation with them. The next one was getting distracted. So this happens in two ways. One is physically, where you're looking around or, your body language is somehow conveying that you're not fully there, you're not fully present. But it also happens in the course of the conversation when we jump around from one topic to another. And the reason that we sometimes do that is we're not too sure of how to address this issue. So we just jump to something else. Or the other person is trying to, is not satisfied with the answers they're getting. So they're just dragging us all over the place. And what we want to always be doing is we want to maintain control of the conversation. So when we're on topic A, we want to deal with that topic and before we move on to something else. We don't want to have the other person taking us all over the place because that's not really helpful, to anybody. One single conversation is not going to address every possible objection or question or curiosity that the other person has. So you want to be humble in how much you try to achieve in one conversation and try to stick to one thing at a time. The next one was trying to prove the other person wrong. Now, this can be very tempting to do, especially when we're talking about an aspect of the faith that we're really passionate about. So if you're a Muslim woman and you get asked about hijab, you might have a lot of feelings about that. You may have gotten asked about that a lot before, and all those previous experiences just come to the front of your mind. And so you sometimes go into that conversation with, I have to prove them wrong on this. But what we need to remember is that doesn't help the other person in any way. It doesn't leave them with a positive, impression in any way. So what we have to do is we have to kind of hold our feelings in check in that moment. And rather than bring all of our previous baggage from all the other times in the past when we've had this conversation and it didn't go well, we need to sort of clear the slate and just give this person the benefit of the doubt. And again, give those simple answers. Don't go into a whole lot of detail. Allow the other person to ask follow-ups if they want to know more. The next one was needing the other person to agree with you. So I want you to really pay attention here because this is so important when we're talking about Islam. Your objective when you're having a conversation with another person is not to gain their approval. So you practicing your faith does not hinge on this other person liking you, agreeing with you, or approving of you. All of the way that you practice and the beliefs that you have are independent of any other person. And so you always want to, even while you have this dialogue and you're open and you're talking to people, you want to remember and remind yourself that your being a Muslim does not hinge on anybody else being happy about that or approving of that, right? And so, no matter what level someone else is at, obviously they're welcome to ask you questions and engage, but you're not sharing information because you need them to agree with you. You're sharing information in a genuine attempt to educate the other person, right? So when you go in with that mindset, then you automatically approach the conversation in a very different way than if you go in with somebody has to win and somebody has to lose. So it doesn't have to be like that. It can simply be an exchange of ideas, and nothing more than that. Conceding defeat or otherwise ending abruptly. So this is one where where we get stuck and we don't know what to say. And so what I want to share with you is some phrases that you can use when you get stuck. And because, there's certain things that you can just memorize that you can use. And this is really important. I hope that, you can either write this down or maybe come back to it later and make a note of it, because this is something that can really help you next time you're in that conversation. It's obvious that there's so much, Islamic knowledge is so vast and so deep that none of us can contain or learn all of it. Even if we're a student of knowledge, even if we're constantly engaged in seeking knowledge, we can't wait until a certain point where we have, X amount of knowledge before we start engaging with other people, right? We have to start where we're at. But at the same time, you don't want to be either making up answers when you don't know the answer, because we don't want to give inaccurate information. And you also don't want to just have to abruptly exit a conversation and leave the person with a bad impression simply because you didn't know the specific answer to their specific question. So in that case, what can you do? You can remember some of these stock phrases, some of these simple scripts that can help you if you're ever stuck in a conversation where the other person is asking you something and you don't know the exact answer to that. So what you can say in that situation is, I don't have a specific answer to your question, but what I can tell you is, and then you follow it with one of these following statements. So these are statements that you can use, for the most common types of questions that we get often about Islam. So the first one would be in a situation where the person is presenting you with something that, Muslims have done, and, why did Muslims do this? And doesn't this mean that Islam, is whatever, XYZ, fill in the blank. So in that case, you can say, I believe Islam is perfect, but Muslims are not. Or there's a difference between what Islam teaches and what some Muslims do. So we have to keep those separate. Because a lot of times, again, people will want to make generalizations about the faith based on the actions of some Muslims. And those are really two separate topics. And that's what you want to convey to the person. So even if you can't answer about the specific incident that they're bringing up, even if that incident is factually accurate, meaning that it did actually happen, it doesn't mean that you have to just freeze in that moment and say, oh, well, yeah, that actually did happen. So what do I say now? What you can say is that, Muslims are not a monolith. Muslims are all different types, just like any other community. And again, that, especially if you're talking to another Muslim, I believe Islam is perfect, but Muslims are not. I've been in conversations with other Muslims where they'll, share some of their doubts about Islam based on the actions of Muslims. And I tell them, no, I believe Islam is perfect, but Muslims are not. So remember that one. Another one, when the person asks you a question specifically related to violence, verses in the Quran that they might point to, and why is that there? And that must mean that, Muslims are violent as a group, or that the religion preaches violence. And what we want to say is that, Islam is a peaceful religion that rejects killing innocent people. If the focus is on Muslim behavior and not the religion itself, you could say something like, violence is a human problem. It's not unique to Muslims or even religion in general, because there's a myth that religion is the primary cause of violence, not even just Islam, but religion in general. And this myth is perpetrated by new atheists, particularly after 9/11. This is one of their main talking points that they use for turning people against religion, and it's Islam in particular, saying that, religion is the cause of most violence. when we look at the statistics from the wars that have happened in over the last 100 years, we see that most of the wars and the casualties that have occurred are from conflicts that have nothing to do with religion. And as a simple example, if we take World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and so many other conflicts, those were not about religion at all. So religion is not needed, to be there as a source of conflict. There's lots of reasons why there have been violent conflicts in humanity. So what we want to say to that again is that violence is a human problem. It's not uniquely a Muslim problem or even a problem with religion in general. Another common area that people often bring up objections and they want answers to is this myth that Islam oppresses women. When we look at the research around American attitudes towards Islam, we find that even among left-leaning Americans, people who tend to vote Democrat, about 30% of them believe this myth that Islam oppresses women. The myth about violence is much less prevalent among Democrats. But the myth about oppressing women is about 30%, which is a pretty high number. So if you get a question related to that, again, I don't have a specific answer to your question, but what I can tell you is misogyny is a human problem. It's not uniquely a Muslim problem. Oppression of women is something that occurs across the world. It's not unique to a specific time or place or culture or religion. And anytime it happens, anywhere it happens, anyone who's doing it, it's a problem. And we as Muslims would agree with that, right? Because our faith teaches us, and this is another line that you can remember, Islam teaches that women should be treated with dignity and respect. So this is a basic tenet of our faith. And it's something that you can remind the person of in a conversation relating to women in Islam when you don't have a specific answer to a specific objection. And what I'm trying to show you with all of these examples is that, even when you don't have detailed answers, it doesn't mean you have to walk away abruptly and not say anything, or that you have to just admit that you're wrong and your religion is wrong and the other person is right. In those cases, if you can even end with a general statement, a truthful statement, something something that's basic about Islam that you know and you believe in, you can always at least end on that. And again, you start by saying, look, you acknowledge that you don't have a specific answer for that question, but this is what you know. This is what you can share with them. And that gives you a graceful way to end that conversation. One more example I'll give you for general scenarios, and then another one that is specific to conversations with Muslims in particular. So the other example is when a person asks you about a verse from the Quran. So they quote, say verse 9:5, for example, or any verse where they say, why does the Quran say this? Can you answer this question for me? And you may have studied it, you may not have studied it, right? I mean, you're not going to know the tafsir of every single verse. So what do you do in that case? Do you simply say, oh yeah, well, I guess I don't really know why that's in there? No. One way that you can address that kind of a question is to say, there's a methodology for interpreting the Quran, so we don't take verses out of context. And if you want to say a little bit more, what you can say is that, if the context was not important, the Quran would have been revealed all at once. But we know that it was not. It was revealed in stages over a period of 23 years in response to circumstances. So the context is one crucial element. It's not the only thing, but it's one crucial element that the scholars use in order to determine or interpret the meaning of a given verse. Besides that, there's entire sciences that are dedicated to interpreting the sacred scriptures. So, for example, with the Quran, there's usul al-tafsir. With the hadith, there's usul al-tafsir. Usul al-hadith. And then there's also for fiqh in general, deriving rulings from the Quran and Sunnah. There's usul al-fiqh, there's maqasid sharia, there's qawaid fiqhiyah. So there's all of these different foundational sciences that the scholars use in order to interpret the intended meaning of a given verse or hadith. So it is not simply a matter of literally interpreting everything or applying every verse to every single situation, right? There's one notion called am and khas, where some verses are general, some are specific, some are a rule, some are an exception. And just one little nugget here for you when it comes to the science of usul al-tafsir is that, and if you just remember this one thing, this will help you a lot in dealing with those questions about specific verses, is that one of the basic principles that the scholars use in order to derive the intended meaning of any given verse is to look at other verses on the same topic and consider them all as a whole, right? So this is referred to in the science of usul al-tafsir as Quran by Quran, meaning that you understand a verse of the Quran based on other verses in the Quran on that same topic. And then the next step is Quran by Sunnah. So you're interpreting what's in the Quran based on authentic ahadith in the Sunnah. So you're taking all of that together to arrive at a holistic understanding of a given topic. And it's not just a matter of, taking one verse and just applying it universally or making a blanket statement about the religion without knowing context, without knowing methodology or anything. So 2 words to highlight here: context and methodology. These 2 things are vital whenever we're trying to interpret the intended meaning of a given verse or hadith. So this is something you can remind the person of, that, again, I don't have the specific answer to your question, but what I can tell you is that there is a methodology for interpreting the Quran, and we don't just take verses out of context. Now, the last sentence or phrase that I want you to remember is one that specifically relates to conversations with other Muslims. And this is in those scenarios where you get a question not about a specific ruling or why does the Quran say this or things like that, but more issues more of a personal nature, where a Muslim might come to you and say, I went through this terrible thing and it caused me to have doubts about Allah. If Allah is there, then why would he allow this thing to happen to me? It's what philosophers often refer to as the problem of evil. The notion that if God exists and if he's merciful, then why do bad things happen to good people? This is a very, very common question that is posed by people who are struggling with their faith. And the way that we answer it is really, really vital in helping that person turn the corner and be able to, reclaim their faith and reclaim their trust in Allah. And so the way that we want to answer this question, and this is probably, most of what I covered today is from last time, and it applies equally whether you're talking to a non-Muslim or a Muslim. But this one in particular, I really want you to pay attention to because it is vital when you are talking specifically to Muslims who are struggling with their faith because of some type of trauma or difficulty that they've been through. In these cases, the worst possible thing we can do is to silence the person for even suggesting that Allah, may not exist or doesn't care about them, shaming them for even saying what they said, rejecting it and not even listening. Those are all things that will do nothing except to push them further away. When you hear statements like, well, I don't even know if God really exists because if he did, how could he let this happen? As someone who loves your faith, and as someone who feels deeply connected to Allah, and as someone for whom their iman is like the rock in their life, it's their anchor, it's the most important thing for them, um, it definitely can be hard to hear another Muslim say things like that. But in that moment, what I want you to remember is rather than reacting to the statement, I want you to try to have some empathy for where that person might be coming from when they're saying that. And the first thing that you want to say in that situation where someone has just shared with you a tragedy or a trauma or a struggle or some type of suffering that they've been through or that they've witnessed, the first thing you want to give them is compassion. That's the very first thing, not advice, not criticism, not ridicule, not shaming them for doubting, but simply compassion. And then once you've done that, I'm so sorry for what you went through. That must have been so difficult. It doesn't have to be something really elaborate, but just a few words to validate, the struggle of that person. And then this is what you can say after that. So again, first, I'm really sorry what you went through. That must have been so hard. And then while I don't have a specific answer for why that happened or why you had to go through that, what I do know is that Allah is the most wise. Allah is the most just. Allah is the most kind. Allah is all aware. Allah is the most knowing. Any names of Allah that you know that can apply in this situation, that's what you want to come back to. What you don't want to do in addition to, criticizing them or shaming them for saying, for sharing what they've shared, in addition to that, you don't want to go into a very lengthy advice session with them. Oh, well, if you just had more faith, you'd be okay. Or actually, what you went through is good because it'll, purify your sins. Or, oh, you shouldn't worry about that. I mean, as a Muslim, obviously, you're going to be tested. Statements like that are good if you're having a sort of a general conversation about the topic of sabr, for example. If you're doing a lecture or you're having a discussion, those are completely fine, statements to make. But when someone has shared a struggle with you, when someone has told you that I am in pain, I just went through this thing, advice is not what they need. You might think that you're helping them, but you're actually hurting them by giving them advice at that moment. Now, later on might be the time, to do that. But in that first moment, you want to start with compassion. And then number two, you want to remind them about who Allah is. So, Allah is not just all knowing. He is also, or all powerful. These are qualities that almost anyone would know, even if they've never studied the names of Allah, even if they're not, super practicing. It's just part of our fitrah to know that Allah knows, or to know that God must be powerful. But what we sometimes don't realize, or what we sometimes forget, is the two names, the most wise and the most just. So these are the names that can really be helpful to remind the person of, because what they tell them is that whatever happened, there was some wisdom in that we don't know, right? So don't try to rationalize it. Don't try to extract what you think the wisdom was, but just remind them that Allah is not only all powerful, but he is also all wise. And then al-adl, the most just, is also important, because when someone is complaining to you about their suffering, what they're basically saying is that this was unfair. If God really exists, this wouldn't have happened. And what you want to remind them of is that Allah is the most just. We may not receive ultimate justice in this life, but Allah has promised that every single person will receive ultimate justice in the hereafter. If we simply limit our view of, our existence to just this life, it can be very hopeless. Because if justice doesn't happen now, we think that, the outcome, how could anything good come out of this? It's only when we remember the hereafter that we can put it in perspective. So again, reminding the person of the qualities of Allah. And the more you know, the more you can share. So the more names that you've studied, Allah is the most merciful, the most kind, the most loving. All of these names you can remind the person of. And why I'm sharing this with you is because almost all of us know at least a few of the names, right? We may not have enough knowledge to, go into a whole let's prove the existence of God conversation, right? That's kind of advanced training that most of us may not have. But even in those kind of conversations, one thing anyone can do is show compassion. And number two, remind the other person about who Allah is. That's something that just about anyone is capable of doing. And you'd be surprised at how much of a positive impact that will make for the other person in that situation. It's really not about having lots and lots of detailed answers to things. It's more about your presence and how you show up, how you portray yourself that really matters. And one thing that I mentioned last time that I want to bring up again is that when someone is coming to you with a question or an objection about Islam, they're not just asking for a factual answer, because that's something they can Google. If that's all they wanted, they can go and Google it and get an answer. When someone comes to you with a question, they want to interact with you. They want to know how you feel about your faith. So your presence in that conversation is as important as the specific things that you say. And so what you always want to leave the other person with is this notion that I love my faith. I may not be the biggest expert in the room, but I love my faith and I am proud of who I am as a Muslim. And I am more than happy to, engage in a conversation with you to help inform you about my faith, but I am in no way seeking your agreement. You are free to, have your own opinions. We're just exchanging information. We're just exchanging ideas. And again, these are not things that you may specifically say, but this is how you want to show up in that conversation. One last line that you can remember and use in almost any conversation. This one is probably the one that will be the most helpful to you, whether you're talking to Muslims or non-Muslims, is that I guess we can agree to disagree. This is where you're basically telling them, look, I see that this is, you have this perspective, I have this perspective, we may not end up seeing eye to eye on this, but we can always agree to disagree. And you might say, well, then what did that conversation achieve? Because I wanted to go in winning the conversation, right? I wanted to prove that I was right. I wanted to make sure that they agreed with me at the end. I wanted them to be convinced of my arguments. But that's not really the approach that we want to go in with. The approach we want to go in with is that I'm just having a dialogue with you. I'm just sharing my perspective with you, and I'm happy to listen to your perspective. At the end of the day, my beliefs are my beliefs. I'm going to remain on what I believe to be true, and you're going to remain on what you believe to be true. If someone is, moved by something that you say, that's great. But you don't need them to agree with you in order for you to be unapologetically Muslim. There is enough space for you both to have a dialogue and at the end just simply part ways saying, I guess we agree to disagree, or I guess we have different perspectives on this. And that is a perfectly legitimate way to end a conversation with someone who has a different point of view than you. Nothing wrong with that at all. So as we're getting close to the end of our time, I want to, first of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been beneficial. I want to thank IAGD for hosting me. It's been very nice being here with you. And before I go, I want to ask you to take a minute and share your feedback with me. Personal growth is something I take very seriously. This topic, Unapologetically Muslim, is one that is very dear to my heart. And so I'm always looking for ways to improve. So if you could take a minute right now and send me an email at Aisha at Aisha8Arshad.com, I would appreciate it so much. I'm going to read every single response I get. Tell me what you liked and tell me what could be better. I'm open to your constructive feedback, your constructive criticism. It will go a long way in helping me to tweak and improve on this series. So again, the email is Aisha at Aisha8Arshad.com. You can also find me at Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook. And for the sisters who are here, I really encourage you to check out my website, Aisha8Arshad.com, where you will see all the details about my upcoming program. So I have a personal growth program coming up for sisters starting on March 6th. And this is where I teach the 5 C's in an interactive way and help you apply them in your own life. So do check that out. And now I'd like to just close with a few du'as, inshallah. So, Ya Muqallib al-Qulub, Thabbit Qalbi ala Dinik. O turner of hearts, keep my heart firm on your religion. Allahumma ghfirli, warhamni, wahdini, wajburni, wa'afini, warzuqni, warfa'ni. O Allah, forgive me, have mercy on me, guide me, support me, protect me, provide for me, and elevate me. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. O our Lord, grant us good in this life and good in the next, and save us from the penalty of the fire. And with that, I'll close. Subhanaka wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.